Hello, and thank you for joining me for today's episode of Big Ideas in Eating Disorders. In this series, we hear from people in the field of eating disorders who share with us their personal and professional journeys, experiences, reflections, and big ideas in ways that never quite get represented in standard academic publications and conferences. I'm Kathy Pike, a professor of psychology at Columbia University and your host of Big Ideas in Eating Disorders. And today I am delighted to be joined by Professor Kelly Klump. Dr. Klump is professor in the Department of Psychology at Michigan State University. Her research focuses on genetic and biological risk factors associated with eating disorders, working both with humans and with animal models. She has built a rigorous research program that has been funded by the National Institute of Health, and she has written prolifically in the field. Dr. Klump has been recognized for her work, including receiving the Leadership Award in Research from the Academy for Eating Disorders, where she also served as president from 2007 to 2008. Kelly, delighted to have you join me today.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I'm so happy to be here.
So let's start at the beginning, Kelly. Growing up years, what were your when did you first have a sense that psychology was of interest to you? And what did you think you might do before you thought you were going to be a psychologist, did you think you were going to be grown up in some other way?
Yes, actually, I originally thought I was either going to be a marine biologist studying sharks, because I was fascinated with sharks in a way that somebody who was growing up in Michigan probably shouldn't be and didn't need to be, but I was fascinated with sharks, or actually a brain surgeon. Those were the two things I thought, I could see myself doing that. And then in 7th grade, we had to dissect fetal pigs. And I quickly realized that I could be neither of those two things, that I was not able to actually dissect this pig in a way that was both helpful to me or happy to me, or that I was very good at. So after that, I was kind of
For me, it was a frog in 7th grade.
Okay, good. So it's not just me, right?
Exactly that moment.
I mean, I'm sure that lesson is all about biology, but I think that lesson is all about having people figure out early on, is this something that I could even do? And for me, it was an absolute no-go. So not too long after that, I became involved in our high school, had a peer support program that you could apply to, and you could become like a peer counselor. So you worked with the counseling office and you really worked kind of one-on-one. You received some training, a little bit of working with peers in the high school. And so I decided to do that, and I loved it. I thought it was really interesting. I loved being helpful to other people. And it really opened my eyes to the different types of psychological difficulties that particularly adolescents, myself, others experience. And it was at that point that I decided, hey, I really think I want to be in some sort of helping profession. And so originally I thought psychiatry, actually, and I was pre-med for my first 3 years of undergrad, but thinking I was going to go into psychiatry, but I'm going to go to med school, I'm going to do this. I didn't love chem. I didn't love those classes, but I did them. And that was my path until I took abnormal psychology. I decided it was an elective. I decided to take it, thought it was really relevant for psychiatry. And quite honestly, it was actually a graduate student that taught that class, and she really outlined the differences between psychiatry and psychology in a very concrete way that was just eye-opening to me. I realized, it was really the psychology part, the part about working one-on-one with people, focusing more on therapy and supportive approaches than medication, that really had me thinking, I think that's where I want to go.
So, Kelly, when you were a peer counselor in high school, what were the common issues?
Well, one very common was eating disorders. And of course, what we know about eating disorders is that they can stay hidden, particularly if they're more of the binge eating related disorders than anorexia nervosa. And I remember being so shocked at my peers, the number of peers that were suffering from some sort of disordered eating pathology, and then B, that you would never know it. Like
Uh-huh.
it was silent. Like you would look at these classmates and peers and think these people have the world in front of them. They have everything. They must be so happy. And in fact, they're not so happy. They are suffering deeply.
Right.
But you would never know it from being in class. So that I'm glad you asked that, Kathy, because that coupled with family histories in my family of eating pathology and some anxiety and depression that really had me early on decide, okay, psychiatry, but also eating disorders. And then, so even when I switched to psychology, I really wanted to focus on eating.
You knew it was going to be around eating
Yeah.
behavior. And it's
Yep.
interesting because as you describe being in abnormal psychology, in your abnormal psychology course, the connection around the psychological aspects, the interpersonal aspects, it sounds like that was, you knew that was true because you knew it already in high school, that that's what mattered to you, but knowing by discipline where you would be able to spend more time focused on those issues versus in psychology versus psychiatry
Yes.
got you along this journey. So you're going to pursue psychology. You know that there's something around binge eating that's going to be part of your
Mhm.
professional journey. How did that shape where you went to graduate school and what you did in graduate school?
Yeah. So as soon as I decided psychology, I remember my pre-med advisor saying, well, that's really hard to get into. Of course, I'm like, well, so is med school. But she said, right now, you need to get research experience. So I first just looked for somebody. I went to Michigan State who did eating disorders. There was no eating disorder research going on. I did research in other labs. And then when I went to apply for doctoral programs, I specifically looked for those that had somebody that did eating pathology or something broadly related to that. So this was in 1992 is when I would have been looking to apply, and there weren't that many eating disorder researchers in departments of psychology. We have way more now. We're still a small field, but I ended up applying to labs that had someone studying eating disorders or related disorders, anxiety, depression, etc. And then I was just lucky enough to get into the doctoral program at University of Minnesota, and Gloria Leon was an eating disorder researcher in the clinical psychology department there. So I applied to work with Gloria, and fortunately, I was admitted, and felt very, very fortunate for that.
Terrific. So let's spend a minute, if you could tell us about Gloria Leon and her role as a mentor and how you see her in helping to shape the field.
Gloria, what a strong woman. I don't think there is a female faculty member from that era or any era, quite frankly, but particularly that era, who wasn't just a strong woman who, number one, wanted to mentor other women in the field. And I will forever be grateful to Gloria for kind of giving me both the confidence scientifically to move forward in this field, but the confidence as a woman to move forward in this field, and giving me the tools to know how do you navigate academia, which at that time was still very male dominated. And she really was very careful to give advice on all levels that was necessary for a female scientist, scientific, mentoring, but also the professional piece of how do you navigate this space. And she was always, the cool thing about Gloria is that you would work on your thesis with her, papers, and she would be very, she gave very specific comments and details, and was very, very like, you can improve this here, improve that here. And then when you got in your defenses, she was like your number one champion. She was, because she had already taken you through the paces and she knew you could do it, and she'd given you that confidence, and she was just amazing to have in those spaces too. So, and in terms of the field, again, Gloria is one of those pioneering scientists in our field who at a time where we were male dominated, very male dominated, she was studying risk factors for eating disorders, stressors, in particular psychosocial and stressor effects on eating pathology. And one of the, I think, we don't have a ton of longitudinal studies in our field, but she had one of the biggest longitudinal studies of risk factors for eating disorders in the field.
Terrific. Well, it really is an important punctuation point for us to recognize the women in the field and all of our mentors from that generation, but particularly someone like Gloria, who really was a trailblazer. So how exciting to be under her mentorship, for you to be thinking about, okay, how do I be part of this story and contribute? What were the first things that you studied? What were the questions you were asking?
Yeah, this is another way that Gloria was just terrific as a mentor. So I came in thinking I was going to look at primarily kind of stressors and psychosocial risk factors. And in the first year of graduate school at the University of Minnesota, you are required to take a behavior genetics class. Now, if my mom joined me on this podcast, she would be laughing with you all right now, because I complained for a full summer about having to take behavior genetics when I'm going in a clinical psychology program. I did genetics, I did chem, I was pre-med. Why am I having to take this class? My mom heard it the whole summer. Well, lo and behold, I loved that class. So the behavior genetics class was all about how do you disentangle genetic from environmental, from gene environment interplay, and I absolutely fell in love. Here's the problem. Gloria Leon does not do behavior genetics, right? Gloria Leon did eating disorders, stressors, but behavior genetics was not part of her area of expertise. So this is what a terrific mentor Gloria was. I met with her. I let her know that I loved this area. We had to do a first year research project. And she said, hey, I don't know anything about this, but I think we have twins in this school-based data. Do you want to collect your own data and do a twin study? And I was like, yes. A lot of mentors would say, no, I don't do twins. I don't do genetics. I don't know a lot about genetics. You need to do something that's in my area of expertise. Gloria did not say that. She opened up the floodgates for me, gave me the most amazing opportunity to collect my own data, to really kind of delve deeply into behavior genetics, and then also facilitated my getting a co-mentor in Bill Iacono, who is the director of the twin studies at Minnesota. And so that kind of set me on the path of Gloria was my eating disorder mentor. And then Bill Iacono and Matt McGew from the twin registry are the ones who taught me about behavior genetics. And she was completely open to me having this co-mentorship model, and really is the person that opened the gate to allow me to pursue what's become kind of my passion.
So, wow, you've got these giants who are working in the area of genetics, behavioral genetics. You've got this pioneer in the area of eating disorders. You put them together. How do you put this together at the beginning with eating disorders? Yeah. We're early in the field when you're starting to ask these questions and teasing apart the point that you made, the environment, the genetics, the interaction, the epigenetic effects. Yeah. What questions, where were we in terms of the maturity of the questions we were asking, and how did you get started?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In a lot of ways, it was this moment of, oh my gosh, I love this, but oh my gosh, there's not a lot out there yet, which as a beginning grad student is scary. And, everyone else is like, that's great, you can make a mark. And you're thinking, kind of great, or it might be, maybe no one's studying it for a reason. So we were early in the field. Ken Kendler at VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University, had a twin registry. He had started to publish some data about the heritability of, his was on bulimia nervosa, not as much anorexia nervosa. Mike Strober, Walt Kay, they had all begun to do family studies saying, hey, these things run in families. But if you're just doing a family study where you're just looking to see, are there more eating disorders in families of individuals with eating disorders than not? That's if that's the case, which Walt and Mike and Cindy at this point isn't quite in the field, Cindy Bullock, but pretty soon Cindy Bullock comes onto the scene, which is another wonderful female scientist in our field. The family studies show that, yes, it aggregates in families, but you still don't know if it's genetics or environment. So Ken Kendler had some just initial twin study data, and I was just lucky enough that Bill and Matt's studies, the Minnesota Twin Family Study, had collected data, even though on eating disorders and eating disorder symptoms. So I feel very fortunate to have walked in and said, oh, I'm kind of interested in this. And Bill and Matt said, oh, we have these data that nobody's looked at. Would you like to look at it? And so I said a resounding yes. And the first study I did with them was just kind of low-hanging fruit, just looking at heritability across different ages, but it ended up being something that kind of set me on the rest of my career too.
So you get started. What did you learn? What do you remember the findings?
I do. So my first, I would say, actually, I think it was my first twin study. So the data I collected on my own, I had a small number of twin pairs. It was actually a question that didn't relate to genetics or environment. It related to an underlying assumption of twin studies. So that was my first study, but it wasn't really looking at heritability. My first big study was my dissertation. And what the Minnesota Twin Family Study had were data on two cohorts of twins. One was age 11 and another was age 17. And they had eating disorder symptoms, like a questionnaire assessment of all different kinds of eating disorder symptoms. They had binge eating, compensatory behavior, weight concerns, and body dissatisfaction. And so for my dissertation, I thought, well, I'm going to analyze these data. We don't yet know, we don't have really good estimates of just what's the heritability in general. But more importantly, we have no idea if the heritability changes across age or development. So from my behavior genetics training and my behavior genetics class, I knew that for some pretty key psychological traits and disorders, the degree of genetic influence can change as kids develop and advance through time. So kind of the prototypic example back then and now is intellectual abilities. So intellectual abilities are commonly very environmentally mediated in childhood. And then as kids advance through adolescence into adulthood, genes typically become more important. Now, of course, that's within if we're talking about more advantaged populations, that happens. If we're talking about disadvantaged populations, the environment continues to play a big role across development. But in more advantaged populations, that's what you see. So I was aware of that and I thought, if we're talking about a developmental disorder, eating disorders are pretty developmental in origin. We tend not to see it early on in childhood or before puberty. It peaks in increases in prevalence throughout adolescence. And then we don't see a ton of new onset cases after age 25. Right. So I basically started thinking about, can I take a developmental design that they've used for other traits and disorders and apply it to eating disorders? So my first study was, do you see differences in the degree of genetic influence on eating disorder symptoms at age 11 versus age 17? Is it like IQ, where you see a pretty dramatic shift in this degree of genetic and environmental influence? Word to the wise, I found the opposite of what I hypothesized. And this is, I think, good for, I swear, some of my most
honest science,
right? And some of my most important findings in terms of how I view them as important, in terms of really shaping my thinking, are the ones that didn't turn out the way that I thought. So I hypothesized that I would see stronger heritability at age 11 than age 17, thinking if you're an 11-year-old twin who is already engaging in pretty severe levels of eating disorder symptoms, I thought there must be like a higher genetic or biological loading for it if you're experiencing that at age 11 than age 17. So I hypothesized stronger genes at 11, less at 17. I found the complete opposite. I found that age 11, there was no genetic influence on eating disorder symptoms, and there was a 50% roughly heritability of eating disorder symptoms at age 17. So dramatic developmental shifts, just not what I expected.
And really then when you're confronted with data like that, or when you're gifted with data like that, it gives you all kinds of opportunity to think hard about what you're seeing and generate some new ideas.
Exactly.
So here you are with these findings that look very different from what you expected, but you're on to something. right? You're really onto something, and you have more than a foothold. You're sort of on the journey.
Yep.
So can you describe for us, Kelly, what some of the milestones are that stand out for you in terms of your thinking around understanding how we do this work and what we're learning related
Yeah.
to risk and parsing how we understand what contributes to risk?
Yeah. Yeah. This was actually, as you said, a big milestone for me, finding something unexpected. And I think for me, and I think this is something that we as a field do well, and we have to continue doing is, whenever we get an unexpected finding, the next question is always like, why the heck could that be? How does this lead to my next research question? And for me, at that moment, I'm like, well, what happens between 11 and 17 in girls? Kind of a really big thing happens. It's puberty, right? And so that led me to, well, maybe this isn't an age difference. Maybe there's something about puberty. We'd already known that in the eating disorder field, pubertal development is a pretty strong risk factor for the development of eating pathology. And we've known that for some time, and we always focused on all the physical changes of puberty, which are profound in girls, move girls away from beauty ideals in terms of increased adiposity and things like that. And we've always thought that that's kind of what increased eating disorder risk. This was a milestone for me in terms of thinking, well, there's biological changes at puberty too, and hormonal changes at puberty too. Could that play a role? And that's actually what led me to some extent to come to Michigan State for my faculty position, because we have experts here in the influence of gonadal hormones on behavior. And so I came and started working with experts in that, and soon learned that ovarian hormones actually turn genes on and off in the brain. And that's what got me thinking, oh, that could be that at puberty, you get increases in these hormones, and that's what's actually driving the increases in the genetic influences, in addition to the psychological factors.
Let me ask you a question here, Kelly. Yeah. You mentioned gonadal hormones. You mentioned puberty. Maybe just all of us sort of know what that means, but from a scientific perspective, what specifically matters about puberty and hormones, or which hormones are we talking about?
Yes, no, great question. So when I say gonadal hormones, those are hormones that are linked to the gonads in males and females. So in males, the primary gonadal hormone is testosterone. And in girls, the primary gonadal hormones are estrogen and progesterone. So for the data in my dissertation, I was looking at all girls. I was really thinking, if hormones are driving this effect, it's going to be estrogen and or progesterone. And the reason that I thought that might be is that pubertal development, which we already knew was linked to eating disorder risk, is actually driven by changes in gonadal hormones in girls and boys. And in girls, it's the estrogen, primarily estrogen actually, that drives the pubertal changes that you see in girls and leads to the post-pubertal period of development. So when I started thinking about the mean age of puberty in girls is 12.5. That happens between age 11 and 17. Maybe it's not genetic influences increase from 11 to 17, maybe because most of them are going through puberty at that time. Maybe it's this increase in estrogen in particular during pubertal development that is driving some of those genetic effects. So what's interesting is you might think, well, how do hormones drive pubertal development, right? Like, how does that work? I had no idea, Kathy. I had no idea. When I became an assistant professor, I thought hormones might matter. And that's like as far as my really like sophisticated thinking went. I got to MSU. I met with Cheryl Sisk, who's a behavioral neuroscientist, who's an expert in hormones. I left her office as an assistant professor with a stack of books this high and went home to find out, oh my gosh, the way hormones drive pubertal development is that in the brain, they act as what we call gene transcription factors. They diffuse through cell membranes in your brain, and they turn genes on and off. So the reason we get pubertal changes is you get these increases in estrogen during puberty that leads to turning genes on, which leads to the production of proteins, which leads to breast development and all those changes. The interesting thing about these hormones is they not only influence genes involved in physical development, they directly regulate genes in the serotonin system, in the dopamine system, opioids. So all of these neurotransmitter systems that we think are important for eating disorders, these hormones regulate, turn genes on and off within those systems.
You've got these early findings that are counterintuitive to what you thought. Good, honest science, right? You lean into it. You are trying to figure it out. You've got some new ideas. There's this momentum and this accumulation of data that you've largely built, and then others in the field are building, that you're weaving into the story that gets you to this big idea, which is a new idea. It's sort of an idea revisited, but new, about what is the role of hormones in eating disorders and binge eating in particular. Share with us where you are on these big ideas that are exciting you in the work that you're doing today.
Yeah, I mean, you have a great way of summarizing all of this. I need to bring you to my lectures, Kathy. That's exactly it. Where we are now is we're excited about being able to build out this model to not only think about hormones kind of turning genetic risk on and off, but also thinking about how they might have direct effects on eating pathology, not just during puberty, but during emerging adulthood. And now the latest work we're doing is during the menopausal transition. So what this work helped me think about and learn is, obviously in humans, we can't take somebody's ovaries out. We would never do that. But we have these kind of natural biological experiments in women's development that can allow you to model these effects and see, is it the case that these hormones just turn on kind of genetic risk, and then these are genes in like serotonin or dopamine that actually are contributing to risk? Or are these hormones having direct effects on the symptoms, not through genetic influences, and directly influencing the symptoms in a way that we hadn't thought of before? And the best way to do that is to use these natural experiments like pubertal development. You can follow people across pubertal development. You can look at different stages and look to see how are the hormones impacting genetic risk and also just overall level of disordered eating. In emerging adulthood, for better or worse, we have this thing called the menstrual cycle. In women who are ovulating, we know exactly what our hormones are going to do every 28 to 35 days. They follow the exact same pattern. The peaks and valleys will vary across women, but the pattern stays the same. If you collect data across the menstrual cycle in twins, you can you collect hormones, binge eating, and disordered eating data across multiple cycles. You can look to not only see, do the natural changes in these hormones that happen every month predict changes in eating disorder symptoms? And since we look at it in twins, we can look to see, is that driven by changes in genetic risk across the menstrual cycle? And then we can also look during perimenopause. It's another developmental period where the female reproductive system goes under major overhauls for a year, years, up until menopause hits. You can look during that time period in life again to see, do these natural changes in hormones that happen to every woman, do they actually cause, or not cause, we can't say cause in humans, but do they predict changes in binge eating in the way that we would predict given their effects earlier in development?
So Kelly, tell me, all of these questions that you're asking now, how are you putting them together? What's the big idea from these questions that you're going to test going forward, or that you are testing now?
Yep, no, it's an excellent question. So the big idea that we are testing now and thinking through is a much more nuanced big idea than I thought we'd ever had at the start of all of this. And the more nuanced new idea is that ovarian hormones are not risky for the vast majority of women. We know this because every woman at some point in their life typically is going to have a menstrual cycle, right? Every woman's going to experience these fluctuations across her menstrual cycle, but not every woman develops binge eating or eating disorder symptoms during the course of their menstrual cycle. Only a small proportion develop it. So the fact that not every, women have all of these hormonal changes, but the vast majority don't have eating pathology. That's a really important feature of our study that we're now thinking about and helping lead us to the next part of our model.
Okay, so only a small percentage or a percentage develop these disorders. So tell us then, what role do you think the hormones play? How do they do this work?
Yes.
How do they have their impact?
Yep. What we think is happening is that we have a gene by hormone interaction that for individuals who are at genetic risk for eating disorders, and we don't quite yet know what that genetic risk is, but for individuals who are at genetic risk for eating disorders, these changes in ovarian hormones could, we think, activate genetic risk for eating disorders and be one of many factors that could lead to that person developing an eating disorder. If you have, or when you have these hormonal changes at puberty, across the menstrual cycle, at perimenopause, they will be completely benign and not have an effect on you if you don't have some sort of genetic risk for eating pathology. If you do have genetic risk, this could be one of other factors that could trigger increased risk for eating pathology. And we think it does that through, again, these gene transcription effects, where it could be amplifying the production of genes that put you more at risk for an eating disorder.
What do you see as critical issues going forward in terms of doing this work, either in terms of what you think what would be a real breakthrough and what to avoid?
I'll start with what to avoid, because I think that's easier. Because I think as scientists, we're always like, wow, what not to do. I think we do have to avoid thinking in a causative way, and that hormones are causing eating disorders, or taking hormonal contraceptives are causing anything. All of these studies are, we call them quasi-experimental. We don't know if they cause. We think they're a part of a pathway, but we don't know. And I think the other thing to avoid is to make blanket statements, because this has been in our not so distant past of women's health research, right? There was a time when it was like, well, women are weak because of their menstrual cycles, which for me, studying the menstrual cycle is something is struck fear in me, that somebody would think that I'm like contributing to these models of, oh, see, women are weak because of their ovarian.
Hysteria really does mean a wandering uterus.
Right, exactly. So I think we have to strongly avoid making these blanket statements about what these effects of hormones are and inferring that these hormones make women weak in some ways. One thing that I haven't talked about, because there's not enough time in this podcast, but estrogen is actually an interesting hormone and can be very protective for women. So actually, a lot of these hormones make us stronger, which is a really good message. But going back to this idea of having blanket statements about women, or blanket statements about hormone, or any blanket statements about causation, really where we're moving in my lab is a personalized medicine approach. These hormones may be risky for a particular type of woman who might be in a particular economic, sociocultural context, within a particular. We really need to avoid thinking that these are risk factors broadly, and start to think about, of course, we can't know for each individual woman what is that risk profile, but we can start to identify groups of individuals for which this cluster of risk factors may put them at increased risk. And I think that's where, in terms of where we're going forward, as somebody who likes to think they study more kind of mechanistic things, I'm always thinking, gosh, I don't know when this is ever going to translate into something that's going to help an individual person, but I'm really getting excited that we might be getting to that point. Not that we're going to have a biological treatment, not that we're going to be able to say a lot about the biology, but that maybe we can start to influence medical clinical practice to provide one more piece of data that as you are thinking about a woman's menstrual cycles, as you're thinking about hormonal contraceptives, perimenopause, we start asking about not just eating disorders, but family history of eating disorders, family history of anxiety disorders, and recognize, just like we do at the doctor's office, we have to say, have we been depressed or down in the past 2 weeks, right? We screen for depression, we screen for anxiety, we forget about eating disorders. And what hopefully our data will suggest, especially for women, because women are always with reproductive health specialists. It is ingrained, men know, women, yes, is that we can influence reproductive health practices in terms of realizing that these hormones can have effects on mental health, both good and bad, and that the key is going to be really understanding a woman's risk profile, and hopefully we can contribute data to that moving forward to help them make their best choices around reproductive health. So for example, some of the hormonal contraceptives might be more risky for someone who's at genetic risk, but there are hormonal contraceptives that wouldn't be risky at all, regardless of your genetic risk. So really starting to inform that practice so that women, an individual woman, can benefit from the work that we're doing. That's what we're hoping to do moving forward. And we have a couple grants that are looking at that right now, and we're hoping to be able to do that.
The question that comes to mind for me, we are seeing increased rates of men presenting with eating disorders. And actually, as you get to the binge eating disorders, pretty even or much closer to even or much greater representation. Still more women presenting for treatment, but much more represented in that community, and certainly in the non-clinical samples of binge eating, individuals with binge eating. So how do we, just wonder, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, that's another arm of our research lab. Dr. Kristen Colbert, she was actually an undergraduate volunteer research assistant in my lab way back when I first started my lab. She was then a grad student. She has looked at eating disorders in males and looked at the effects of testosterone. She is now back at MSU in a research professor position, and she and I have a grant where we're looking at the effects of testosterone in the same way we've done it in women with ovarian hormones on genetic and overall risk for eating pathology in boys. And what's really interesting, and this is getting us into kind of evolutionary concepts within reproductive health, is that we're finding similar effects of testosterone in men. And what we're finding, we haven't talked about this in women, but this will touch upon it, is that in men, levels of testosterone that are perhaps developmentally lower than would be ideal seem to have relationships to genetic risk and overall risk for eating disorder symptoms in males. So that in both males and females, these gonadal hormones are doing very similar things in terms of eating pathology risk. They're different hormones, but they're doing very similar things. And when you take a big step back, and this is some of the reading I did early on with Cheryl Sisk, it makes sense because these hormones have direct effects on food intake. They always have. We've known that testosterone directly increases food intake in males, and in women, estrogen and progesterone have different effects on food intake. We've known this since like the 60s. So when you think about what is the purpose of reproduction, well, it's to have future species. What do you have to have for reproduction? You have to eat, food intake. These hormones directly affect food intake, energy, metabolism. And so it makes, this is kind of where we're going. It's fuzzy at this point, but it makes intuitive sense that these hormones within each sex are going to have these effects on eating phenotypes, food intake, and metabolism, particularly during reproductive periods or reproductive changes that lead one to reproduce. And so that if you have levels that are off from what might be considered normative for that development, that could be part of the risky picture in terms of activating genes, et cetera, et cetera. So the male story is a little bit less developed than the female story at this point because we currently have the grant that we're doing, but we do think testosterone likely has effects in males like we see estrogen and progesterone in females.
Your research is full of ideas, full of rigorous methodologies. And really, as I hear the story and have observed the story over the years and been a bit, part of the story over the years of exploring risk factors, I am time and again impressed by your commitment, Kelly, to taking on these complex questions and not simplifying them just because that would make it a lot easier to tell the story. So thank you. And thank you for continuing to lead on this work. Last question for you. You project forward 5 years. You're talking about personalized medicine. One or two things that have to happen in order for you to build that bridge that you hope, where your research will really start to impact clinical care?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest thing that has to happen is that we are able to finish the larger scale data collections that we're doing to run the analyses. We have to be able to, who knows if we'll confirm our hypotheses, right? That's been the story of my life. We have to show that what we think, or see if we find what we think is happening. And then we really need to partner with folks in the neuroendocrinology field, in reproductive health, in adolescent health, and get these findings out there. And that, I think, is going to be a challenge. I think the Academy for Eating Disorders, lots of professional organizations have been partnering with different groups, but in science and in clinical practice, we are still so siloed. And so I think that's going to take a lot of work. And then once again, at another point in my career, I'm going to be at a point of going to professionals who are experts in that type of dissemination and really know what they're doing there to help learn and collaborate with them on how do we get that word out. I really hope in 5 years, at the very least, that when you go in for an OB/GYN or GYN or internist appointment, and they're thinking about, or anything related to hormones, that there's some questions about eating disorder risk that are included. As I'm saying it, I'm like, that seems like such a high goal, but that would make me really happy if in 5 years we are at least at that point.
I know with your energy and your focus, you've been able to chart quite a journey. I can imagine that will be a next mile marker. So thanks for sharing your story, your big ideas, and talking with us today, Kelly.
I've enjoyed it so much. Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you for doing this for the field. I've watched some of the videos and they are outstanding. Thank you.